For more, we have with us Dr. James Kim, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. It's good to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. So this trip Trump took to Iraq came very much as a surprise, especially considering the fact that he's never visited U.S. troops in war zones. There's been much analysis of why he took this trip and why now, and what he was trying to achieve. But what do you think he was, why do you think he went?
Well, several things. Obviously, one is that the presidents usually make this trip to the front lines and meet with the troops to boost their morale. And it's just good for photo ops, and it looks good for the domestic audience. And plus, he's been getting some criticism for not making this trip for some time, as was mentioned earlier. But there's another issue here, which is some domestic challenges. The government is facing a shutdown, and the Democrats are pinning the blame on him. I think he wanted a sort of a change of scenery to turn the attention away from some of the difficult issues domestically and focus on some of these other issues, like Syria, for instance.
During his trip, he said that the U.S. Cannot continue to be the policeman of the world, especially as it's not fair for the U.S. to take all the burden. That's quoting, paraphrasing Trump there. But can you explain how different this stance or thinking is compared to previous administrations?
Well, it's a sea change. Obviously, if you take a look at all the presidential administrations since World War II, they have taken the position that U.S. leadership is critical for maintaining global order and peace. Now the U.S. posture has changed since the election in 2016. And this kind of statement, followed by real action that signals the U.S. unwillingness to play this leadership role that they used to play, is somewhat troubling. And it is very different. It's a very big departure from previous administrations.
Why do you think Trump believes this change is necessary? I mean, and what effects could it have for America's position in the world?
I think President Trump has been fairly consistent on this point of view, and he campaigned on this issue during the election in 2016. His point being that he wants to define national interest more narrowly in the way where the benefits and the costs can be materially measured, and he's looking for material gains as well as to minimize the costs associated with playing the leadership role. Now, things like global peace is difficult to quantify. So it becomes a lot harder using his framing to define national interests in the way that he wants to define it. This is again consistent with his point of view. He's already campaigned on the campaign promise that he wants to pull out of Syria. This isn't the only promise that he's kept. He's kept all these other promises on things related to, for instance, trade, things related to the climate accord, along with some other obligations on things like UNESCO, for instance. These are things that we have not seen other presidential administrations do, that President Trump has actually said and followed through with action.
You say President Trump is following through with this promise to pull out of Syria, but will it be that easy? There are many obstacles still in the way that could trip up his plan of his.
Right. So essentially, if you take a look at the Constitution, Article 2 stipulates that he is the commander-in-chief. So it could be a constitutional issue, and whether or not Congress weighs in and how much of a role they could play in checking his ability to be able to do this is going to be a political matter. But this is debatable. And again, President Trump hasn't pulled away from some of these other difficult issues like the wall and the southern border. So I think we'd have to wait and see how this plays out. It really depends, I think, on the political climate in Washington.
Do you think, though, this eventually, this will have the desired effect that he wants back home? Because it seems, especially like he was trying to turn the tides, especially with the Syria announcement, him going to Iraq, was trying to perhaps win some votes, not votes as such, but win favor from the American public. Do you think that will succeed?
Well, I wouldn't discount any possibility when it comes to President Trump. against all odds, he was able to gain a victory in 2016 election. And he understands his base better than anyone. And so I wouldn't discount any possibilities here. And just wait to see how the public reacts to these kinds of moves that the president is making. But the base clearly had a lot to say when he gave out a signal to the Democrats that he's willing to negotiate and compromise on the wall. But again, he went back when the base started to criticize him for not keeping his promise. So on this issue, I'm not going to say one way or the other about this, and I don't think we should underestimate President Trump's ability to deliver on what he promises to do.
Let's broaden this picture out a little bit, because this announcement that the US will no longer be a, quote, policeman of the world has broader implications as well, it seems, because even here in South Korea, because currently Seoul is in negotiations with Washington over a new deal for cost-sharing of US troops on the Korean Peninsula. Trump has many times called for South Korea and other countries to pay more for hosting US troops. I mean, how much pressure do you think Trump's latest comments and actions put on these negotiations that are still ongoing?
Well, tremendous. I think some of his rhetoric has actually gotten some NATO members to up the ante and contributions that they have to their defense spending. So we've already seen some moves by the other allies in Europe. But for South Korea, we're under, I think, even more difficult times because we don't have the special measures agreement finished by the end of this year. It's expiring this year, so we're in overtime. We're moving on to next year, and the gap is relatively large. Plus, these moves by President Trump, along with the rhetoric, doesn't make it any easier for the Moon administration.
Reports have emerged that Washington have asked for a new one-year deal rather than the 5-year deal that they used to have. Seoul is yet to reject it, it seems, but how bad would that be for Seoul to have a one-year deal?
Well, it's like, you know, any contract negotiation. If you have a set contract with a set increase that's locked in for 5 years versus an incremental increase of modest amount and being renegotiated every year, aside from the fact that this puts a lot of pressure on the bureaucrats to go back to the negotiating table after they just finished one. But it could potentially, if you think about a modest increase, and I did some math on this, of about 10% increase incrementally over a 5-year period, the actual amount by the end of the 5th year is going to be larger than the amount that the U.S. is asking at the moment. So it's going to be difficult for the Moon administration, and not only for the Moon administration, but whoever takes this task after his term is over.
I think concerns are further exacerbated by the fact that two key figures who are said to be, should we say, the remaining voices of reason in the White House, the Chief of Staff John Kelly and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Now, they have both left their posts within the last month, and without these kinds of voices explaining the importance of the South Korea alliance and the situation in North Korea, I mean, it raises the risk that Trump really might actually go ahead and perhaps even pull troops out of South Korea.
Well, first of all, there are two issues here. One is we can't discount any possibility when it comes to President Trump and what he intends to do. So partial withdrawal, regardless of what Congress does, in order to stop him from being able to do this, I think that's something that South Korea needs to hedge for and to think about. But again, when it comes to the head of the DOD and whoever's in charge of the staff in White House, it's not directly relevant to the negotiation that's going on now because the State Department is in charge of that. So again, the negotiators in the State Department with a counterpart in MOFA will have to work out this arrangement. But if there's no agreement before the earlier part of next year, then President Trump will want to think about some of the remedies to rectify the situation. And the options that are going to be presented will be presented by, among the people in the room, whoever's in charge of the DOD, and possibly the Chief of Staff could also be weighing in on that discussion. So if there's no agreement, and President Trump is considering some of his options. Some of these critical players in that room in Oval Office will be very important in determining what the U.S. will do to rectify the situation.
Any gap in the South Korea-U.S. Alliance is alarming because despite relations with North Korea improving this year, they're still a threat. I mean, a report came out on Thursday that said although no missile launches or nuclear tests were performed this year, evidence suggests that North has moved on to mass production from research rather than research and development, and that Kim Jong-un could have as many as 100 nuclear weapons by 2020. So how important is it to have this U.S. presence on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, anytime you have elevated threats, it's a concern from a national security standpoint. Any measures that you can take to raise readiness and raise your capabilities, I think, is going to be important. But aside from what South Korea is able to do for itself, how it is able to coordinate with its allies in order to deter that threat, I think it's also very important. So, and we knew that this was always an important thing. The threat was always there, but with this new report, it seems to suggest that the threat is even bigger. And at this point, how the public reacts to this is going to be, I think, critical. Will the public put more pressure on the Moon administration to suggest that more needs to be done to keep the alliance together? If so, then the president has a two-front battle, not only from the United States, but also being able to convince and persuade the domestic actors that we shouldn't make compromises on these negotiations, or we should. Again, it'll weigh in on the president very heavily. I don't envy the position that he's in.
So what can President Moon and Seoul do at this position? I mean, what cards do we have to play that we can get perhaps some of what we want? Or is it overwhelmingly in favor of Trump's pressure?
I think we have to think about a range of possibilities. So the worst case scenario to the best case scenario. Worst case scenario being that a partial withdrawal has to be considered as an option here. The gap is just way too large. South Korea is currently paying about $890 million. U.S. is asking approximately $1.2 billion. That's a $300 million gap. If the two sides can't close that gap, then will the U.S. proportionally decrease the amount of troop presence here to match the $890 million amount? Again, if that's being considered, then South Korea needs to have an option for that. Best case scenario is that some kind of an agreement is reached. Something in between could be some creative combination between these two. So instead of simply negotiating on the SMA alone, link the SMA issue with some of the other outstanding issues having to do with coordination on North Korea, for instance, or the Section 232 auto tariff that is being considered by the Commerce Department. Some of these issues can be give and take. So if South Korea decides to make some compromises in one of these areas, what are some other areas where South Korea can gain something from the United States? It's a transactional Trumpian way of approaching these negotiations, and there's no reason why President Trump will shy away from this approach. So this is another creative way to handle the problem or manage it.
So it looks like President Moon might have to come up with his own way to do art of the deal. Anyway, we're out of time today. Thank you for coming in today and sharing us your insights.
And thanks for having me.